They called him a traitor before he ever said a word. And in a town like Red Hollow, that word carried more weight than a loaded rifle, heavier than the dry air that hung still at high noon, heavier than the silence that followed it. Caleb Rowan stood in the middle of Main Street, boots planted in the dust, the sun cutting sharp lines across the wooden buildings. His shadow stretched long behind him like something that refused to leave, and beside him, just half a step back, stood the girl. Quiet, steady, her dark hair tangled with wind and travel, her sleeves stained from a journey no one here cared to understand, and in her hand, barely visible unless you knew to look, a small silver necklace caught the light, flickering like a signal no one else could read. "Step aside, Rowan," Mayor Harlan Pike said, voice smooth but tight, the kind of voice a man uses when he's already decided how a story ends. And the crowd shifted with him, boots scraping wood, spurs chiming low, men and women leaning in not for truth, but for confirmation, because in Red Hollow, people didn't ask questions about someone like her. They filled in the answers themselves. Caleb didn't look at the mayor, didn't look at the crowd. His eyes stayed forward, fixed somewhere beyond the line of buildings, like he was measuring distance, not to run, but to stand longer. And when he finally spoke, it was quiet enough that the wind almost took it. "She stays." And that was all. No speech, no defense, just a line drawn in dust that everyone could see but no one wanted to cross. A few men laughed then, low at first, then louder, the kind of laughter that builds courage in groups but dies alone. "Protecting her now, are you?" someone called out. "Didn't know you switched sides." Another voice added, and the word traitor came again, sharper this time, like it had found its mark, but Caleb didn't move, not a shift of weight, not a twitch of his hand, just stood there as if the world could circle him all day and he'd still be there when it stopped. The girl behind him, Asha, said nothing, not even when the mayor took a step closer, not even when the space between them tightened like a drawn wire. She only lifted her eyes once, just once, and looked at Caleb, not with fear, not with pleading, but with something quieter, something that felt older than this town, older than the dust beneath their feet. And for a moment, the noise faded, the laughter thinned, because something in that look didn't belong here. "You're making a mistake," the mayor said, softer now, almost like a warning dressed as concern, but Caleb gave no answer. And that was when the wind changed, just slightly, enough to carry something new across the edge of town, not a sound at first, more like a feeling, a rhythm too distant to name. And a few heads turned, just out of habit, just out of curiosity. But Caleb didn't turn, not yet, because somewhere deep down, he already knew what the others were only beginning to sense, and the girl's fingers tightened around the silver necklace, just enough for the light to catch it again, brighter this time, like it had been waiting for this moment all along. The sound came slow at first, like something the earth itself was trying to remember, a distant rhythm pressing through the dry air, steady and deliberate. And the people of Red Hollow felt it before they understood it. Boots shifting, conversations faltering, eyes drifting toward the horizon where heat shimmer blurred the line between sky and land. Mayor Pike narrowed his gaze, his voice losing some of its earlier certainty as he spoke again, louder this time, as if volume could hold control. "In place. This is your last chance, Rowan." But even he did not sound convinced, because something was changing, something larger than any one man's authority, and the town could feel it settling into their bones. Caleb remained still, his hat casting a shadow over his eyes, but there was a quiet awareness in the way his shoulders squared, like a man who had already measured what was coming and found no reason to step aside. And behind him, Asha shifted just enough for the light to catch the edge of the silver necklace again, a small detail, easy to miss, but it held weight, the kind that did not come from metal but from memory, from meaning carried across miles no one here had walked. "You think they will come for you?" Someone scoffed from the crowd, though the laughter that followed was thinner. Now, uncertain, because the sound on the wind was no longer a question, it was an answer drawing closer with every passing second, and even the horses tied along the rail began to stir, ears flicking, hooves restless against packed dirt, as if they recognized something their owners did not. Caleb finally turned his head, not toward the mayor, not toward the voices behind him, but slightly to the side. just enough to look at Asha without fully facing her, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. Again, hers steady, his unreadable, and she gave the smallest nod. Almost nothing, the kind of movement that would vanish if you blinked, but it was enough to confirm what words did not need to say. "You should not be here," she said softly, her voice barely above the whisper of wind, yet it carried, slipping through the tension like a thread, pulling everything tighter, and Caleb answered just as quietly, "Neither should you." And there was no accusation in it, no judgment, just a statement laid flat between them, honest and unguarded. The rhythm grew louder now, no longer hidden beneath distance, hooves striking ground in unison, not rushed, not chaotic, but controlled, and that was what unsettled the town most, the discipline of it, the absence of noise beyond what was necessary, because men who arrived without shouting did not need to prove anything. A boy near the edge of the street pointed first, his voice cracking as he spoke. "There." And all at once, heads turned. Conversations died, and the horizon sharpened into something real, a line of riders emerging through the heat, silhouettes forming one by one, then 10, then more, until the count stopped mattering and only the presence remained. Mayor Pike took a step back before he realized he had done it, his hand adjusting his coat, as if restoring order to fabric could restore it to the moment, but no one was looking at him anymore. Their attention pulled outward, drawn to the approaching line that did not slow, did not scatter, did not hesitate. Caleb did not move from where he stood, not when the first rider came into clear view, not when the line stretched wider than the street itself, and not when the silence settled fully over Red Hollow, heavy and complete, as if the town had finally remembered how to listen. And in that stillness, the necklace in Asha's hand caught the sunlight once more, brighter than before, no longer a hidden detail, but a signal waiting to be understood. No one spoke when the riders reached the edge of the street, not a greeting, not a warning, not even a breath loud enough to break the stillness, because by then the sound of hooves had already said everything that needed saying, steady and measured, stopping all at once as if commanded by a single unseen hand. And the dust they carried with them settled slowly into the same ground the town had stood on for years without ever truly understanding it. Caleb remained where he was, his boots rooted in place, the brim of his hat low, but his eyes lifted now, meeting the line of riders without challenge, without fear, just recognition of something inevitable, and beside him, Asha stepped forward for the first time, not hiding behind him anymore, not shrinking from the weight of the moment, her hand opening just enough to reveal the necklace fully, the silver catching the light in a way that drew every eye, even those who did not want to look. The lead rider moved then, not fast, not slow, just forward with purpose, his presence carrying a quiet authority that did not need to announce itself. And as he approached, the space between him and Caleb narrowed until it held the entire town inside it. Every whisper, every doubt, every careless word spoken minutes before now hanging in the air like something waiting to fall. Mayor Pike cleared his throat, trying to reclaim ground that had already shifted beneath him. "This is private land," he said, but the words landed without weight, slipping past the moment as if they no longer belonged, because no one was listening to him now, not even himself. The rider's gaze moved first to Asha, resting on the necklace in her hand, and something in his expression changed, not surprise, not relief, something deeper, something that carried years in a single breath. And then his eyes lifted to Caleb, studying him in silence, not as an enemy, not as a stranger, but as a question already answered. Asha took one more step, her voice steady. Now, no longer a whisper, "I told you they would come," and Caleb gave the smallest nod, as if he had never doubted it. As if this moment had been waiting long before either of them stood in this street. Behind them, the town shifted again, but this time it was not curiosity or judgment. It was something quieter, something closer to realization, the kind that settles slowly and does not leave, because the riders had not come with raised voices or hurried movement. They had come with purpose, and that purpose was not chaos. It was clarity. The lead rider dismounted, his boots touching the ground with a sound that echoed louder than it should have in the silence. And for a brief second, no one moved. No one dared to interrupt the space that had formed between him and Caleb, Because something unspoken had already begun to unfold, something the town could feel but not yet understand. And as the man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Caleb's, the necklace in Asha's hand glinted once more, brighter than before. No longer a question, but the beginning of an answer that would change everything they thought they knew. The man stopped a few feet from Caleb, close enough now that the dust between them settled into stillness. And for a long moment he said nothing, just studied him with eyes that carried distance, memory, and something harder to name, while the entire street seemed to lean into that silence, waiting for a word that did not come. Then, slowly, his gaze shifted to Asha, and when he saw the necklace clearly in her hand, something in his posture changed, not a movement anyone could measure, but a release, like a breath held too long finally let go. And when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying without force. "You kept it." And Asha nodded once, her fingers tightening slightly around the silver, as if the weight of it had always belonged to this moment. Caleb watched without interruption, his expression unreadable, but there was a quiet awareness in the way he stood, like a man who understood he was part of something larger without needing to control it. And the rider's attention returned to him, sharper now, more focused, as if searching for something beneath the surface, something that did not show in dust or clothes or the lines of a man's face. "Where did you get it?" the man asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer, and Asha stepped forward again, closing the distance just enough for the sunlight to fall fully across the necklace. "It was given," she said, and the words hung there, simple, but heavy with meaning the town could not yet grasp. A murmur moved through the crowd, low and uncertain, because this was not how they expected it to unfold. There were no raised voices, no threats, no rush of action, only recognition passing between people they had already judged without understanding. And that realization began to press in, uncomfortable and unavoidable. Mayor Pike tried again, his voice thinner now. "You have no authority here." But even as he said it, he did not step forward, did not place himself between them, because something in the air had shifted beyond his reach, and everyone knew it, even if they would not say it aloud. The rider ignored him completely, his focus locked on Caleb, and after a long pause, he spoke again, quieter this time. "You stood when others would not." And there was no praise in it, no accusation, just a statement of fact, laid down as firmly as Caleb's own words had been earlier. And for the first time, Caleb answered with more than a nod. "She needed someone to stand," he said, and the simplicity of it cut through everything else, through the tension, through the expectation, through the story the town had tried to build around him. The rider's eyes held his for another moment, and then, without warning, he inclined his head, not deeply, not dramatically, just enough to be seen. And that small gesture carried more weight than anything spoken that day, because it was not given lightly, not given freely, and certainly not given to someone the town had just mocked. A ripple moved through the line of riders behind him, subtle but unmistakable, and suddenly the silence felt different, no longer uncertain, but settled, as if a decision had already been made without the need for announcement. And in that quiet, the people of Red Hollow began to understand, slowly, uneasily, that they had misread the moment from the very beginning, and that the man they had laughed at was not the one who had been standing alone. No one dared to speak after that, not because they were told to be silent, but because something inside them had already chosen it, and the weight of that choice pressed down heavier than any order ever could. Caleb did not react to the gesture, did not step forward or back. He simply stood as he had from the beginning, steady and unmoved, but there was a subtle shift now, not in his body, but in the space around him, as if the air itself had acknowledged what the town had refused to see. The rider turned slightly, just enough for the line behind him to catch the signal, and one by one, without a word, the others adjusted their posture, not aggressive, not defensive, just present, fully and undeniably present. And that presence filled the street in a way that made every building feel smaller, every voice less certain. Asha lowered her hand at last, the necklace resting against her palm, its purpose no longer hidden, and when she looked at Caleb again, there was something different in her expression, not relief, not gratitude, something steadier, something that did not need to be spoken because it had Already been proven. You should not have stood alone, the rider said quietly, his voice carrying only to Caleb and Asha, yet somehow heard by everyone, because silence had made room for it. And Caleb answered in the same tone. She was not alone. And that was all. No explanation, no defense. Just truth placed where anyone willing to see it could find it. A man near the edge of the crowd shifted his weight. Then another, the small movements spreading like a ripple across still water, because the story they had built just minutes ago no longer held together. It cracked under the weight of what stood before them, and no one wanted to be the first to admit it. Mayor Pike tried to gather himself, straightening his coat, lifting his chin, but even he could not meet the rider's eyes now. And when he spoke again, the words felt hollow. This town has rules, he said, but no one responded. Not even the people who had followed him without question before, because rules had lost their certainty the moment they were tested against something deeper. The rider looked past him as if the words had never been spoken, his attention returning to Caleb, and for a moment, there was something like recognition there, something that reached beyond this street, beyond this day, into a past that had not yet been named. Not many would have done what you did, he said, and Caleb gave a slight shake of his head, almost dismissive. Not many were here, he replied, and the simplicity of it settled over the crowd like dust, quiet and undeniable. Behind them, the horses stood still now, no longer restless, as if whatever they had sensed earlier had resolved itself, and the wind that had carried the riders into town faded into something softer, something that no longer pressed but simply existed. Asha stepped forward once more, this time not to stand behind Caleb, but beside him, equal in the space they shared, and when she spoke, her voice carried a calm certainty that did not need to rise to be heard. You judged before you understood, she said, not accusing, not angry, just stating what had already become clear, and no one answered her, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to defend, only the quiet realization that the man they had mocked had not changed at all. It was their understanding of him that had been wrong from the very start. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling into every corner of Red Hollow until even the smallest sound felt out of place. And in that stillness, people began to notice things they had ignored before. The way Caleb had not once raised his voice, the way he had not looked around for approval, the way he had simply stood, as if doing what was right did not require an audience. The rider watched him for another long moment, then turned his head slightly toward Asha, his voice softer now, carrying a tone that did not belong to command but to memory. You found him, he said, and Asha gave a quiet nod, her eyes steady. He was already here, she replied, and there was something in the exchange that the town could not fully understand, something that reached beyond this day into a time none of them had seen. Caleb's gaze shifted briefly to the necklace in her hand, the silver catching a thin line of sunlight, and for the first time, a faint recognition crossed his face, not clear, not complete, but enough to stir something buried, like a name almost remembered or a place half forgotten. Where did you get that? He asked, not sharply, not suspiciously, just quietly, and Asha stepped closer, holding the necklace between them. From a man who did not ask who I was, she said, and the words lingered, simple, but carrying a weight that pressed gently against something inside him. The rider watched this, his expression unreadable to the crowd but unmistakably focused, and then he spoke again, this time to Caleb. Years ago, near the river east of here, a storm came without warning, he said, and the town listened, drawn in despite themselves, because the story did not belong to them, yet it was unfolding in front of them all the same. A man found a child alone, frightened, and he did not turn away. The rider continued, and Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in thought, as if a distant image was beginning to take shape just beyond reach. The wind moved lightly through the street, lifting dust in soft spirals that caught the sunlight, and for a moment, everything felt suspended between what was known and what was about to be revealed. He gave her water, the rider said, and something of his own to keep her safe, and as he spoke, Asha lifted the necklace a little higher, the silver glinting brighter now, no longer just an object, but a bridge between past and present, and Caleb's breath slowed. his posture shifting ever so slightly as the memory pressed closer, clearer, the edges sharpening. "You do not remember," Asha said gently, not as a question, but as an understanding, and Caleb gave a small shake of his head. "I remember helping someone," he said, his voice low, "but I did not stay long enough to know what became of her." And the truth of it settled between them, quiet and unadorned. The rider stepped closer then, just one pace, enough to close the distance that had remained, and in that small movement, the entire street seemed to hold its breath again, because something was shifting, something that would change not just what they saw, but what they believed they knew. And as the sunlight caught the necklace once more, brighter than it had all day, it became clear that this moment was not about what Caleb had done today, but about something he had done long before anyone here thought to notice. The memory did not return all at once. It came the way rain comes to dry land, slow at first, a single drop, then another, until the ground could no longer pretend it had always been empty, and Caleb stood there with his eyes fixed on the necklace as something long buried began to rise, not loud, not clear, but undeniable. The river came back first, the sound of it rushing higher than usual, swollen from a storm that had rolled in without warning, the sky dark even in daylight, and a small figure standing near the bank. Alone, too still for a place that moved so fast, and he remembered the hesitation, not from fear, but from distance, from a life that had taught him not to get involved. And then the choice, simple and quiet, the same kind he had made today without thinking, to step forward anyway. "You were there," Asha said softly, and the words did not ask, they confirmed, and Caleb's jaw tightened slightly as the rest of the memory found its place. The way the child had looked at him, not with trust, not yet, but with something close to it, something waiting to see if it would be earned, and he had not said much then either, just offered water, just stayed long enough to make sure she could stand, and before he left, he had taken something from his own pocket, something small, something he did not think he would ever see again, and pressed it into her hand without ceremony. The rider watched him closely now, as if measuring the distance between the man Caleb had been and the one standing here today, and when Caleb finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet weight. "I did not think it mattered," he said, and the truth of that hung in the air, because in his world, small acts were just that, small, not something that echoed years later, not something that returned with the sound of many riders crossing open land. Asha lifted the necklace slightly, her fingers steady. "It mattered," she said, and for the first time, there was something like warmth in her voice, not loud, not overwhelming, just present, and the rider gave a slow nod. "It mattered more than you knew," he added, and behind him, the line of riders remained still, not restless, not impatient, as if they understood that this moment was not about them. It was about something being revealed that had been waiting for its time. The town listened without interruption now, not because they had been told to, but because something in them had shifted, something that made them realize they were no longer the center of this story, and that realization settled quietly, but deeply. Caleb looked from the necklace to Asha, then to the rider, and the pieces came together not as a surprise, but as a recognition of something that had always been there, just unseen. And he exhaled slowly. "You are the child," he said, not as a question, and Asha nodded, her eyes steady, holding his without hesitation, and in that moment, the distance between past and present closed completely. The rider stepped forward one more time, his presence firm but calm, and when he spoke again, his voice carried not authority, but respect, the kind that is not given lightly and never without reason. "You gave without asking who she was," he said, and Caleb met his gaze without flinching. "It did not matter then," he replied, and the rider's expression shifted slightly, something like approval passing through it, quiet but unmistakable. "It does now," he said, and the weight of those words settled over the street, not heavy with threat, but with meaning, because the people of Red Hollow were beginning to understand that what they had seen as weakness was something else entirely, something they had not recognized until it stood in front of them, undeniable and unshaken. The words did not fade when he spoke them. They settled, slow and heavy, like dust after a long ride. And for the first time since the riders had arrived, no one in Red Hollow was thinking about what might happen next. They were thinking about what had already happened, what they had seen, what they had said, and what it now meant. The rider held Caleb's gaze for a moment longer, then turned, not away, but slightly, just enough to include the town in what came next, and that small movement shifted everything, because now the silence belonged to all of them. "You judged a man for standing where you would not," he said, his voice calm, not raised, but it carried across the street with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding, and no one answered him. Not the mayor, not the men who had laughed, not even those who had only watched, because the truth of it had already found its place. Mayor Pike finally stepped forward, though it was not the same step as before, not certain, not commanding, but measured, careful. "We were protecting this town," he said, but even he could hear how thin it sounded, how little it held against what stood before him, and the rider looked at him without anger, without challenge, just a steady, quiet attention that made the words feel smaller the longer they hung in the air. "From what?" Asha asked, her voice soft but unwavering, and the question did not accuse, it revealed, because no one could answer it without facing something they had chosen to ignore. A man near the saloon lowered his head, another shifted his hat in his hands, small gestures, but they carried more meaning than any argument could, because they came from within, not from pressure, not from fear, but from recognition. Caleb did not speak, he did not need to. His presence alone had already said everything that mattered, and the rider turned back to him once more, his expression firm but no longer distant. "You gave without asking, and you stood without expecting," he said, and there was something final in the way he spoke, not an ending, but a conclusion reached without force. Then, without warning, he stepped back, just one pace, and in that single motion, the line of riders behind him shifted as one, not forward, not threatening, but aligning, as if preparing for something not yet visible, and the town held its breath again, not from fear this time, but from anticipation, because something was about to happen, something they could feel but not yet name. Asha stepped closer to Caleb, the necklace now resting in her open palm, and she looked at him not as someone who needed protection, but as someone who had come to return something unfinished. "You thought it was small," she said quietly, "but it carried further than you ever walked." And Caleb glanced at the silver, then back at her, the weight of it clearer now, not as an object, but as a reminder that nothing given in truth ever disappears. The rider lifted his hand slightly, and the movement was enough for every rider behind him to understand, and in the next moment, something unexpected began to unfold, not loud, not sudden, but deliberate, and as the first of them moved, the people of Red Hollow realized that what was coming was not punishment, not confrontation, but something far more difficult to face, something that could not be resisted or dismissed, something that would remain long after the riders were gone. No one expected what came next, not the mayor, not the men who had laughed, not even those who had stayed silent, because when the rider lowered his hand, the line behind him did not advance, did not spread, did not surround the town. Instead, one by one, they dismounted, boots touching the ground in quiet unison, and then, without a word, without a signal anyone else could see, they stopped, forming a still line along the edge of the street, not as a threat, not as a display of power, but as something else entirely, something the town could not name, but could feel pressing gently against their understanding. The rider stepped forward once more, his eyes moving across the people of Red Hollow, not searching, not accusing, just seeing, truly seeing, and that was what unsettled them most, because for the first time, they felt as though they were being measured not by what they owned or said, but by what they had done when it mattered. Then he turned back to Caleb, and in that quiet space, he spoke, his voice low, steady, carrying a weight that did not need to rise. "You stood when no one asked you to," he said, "and you gave when no one was watching. And there was no praise in it, no reward promised, just truth placed where it could not be ignored." Caleb said nothing. He only glanced once at Asha, then back at the rider, as if to confirm that what had happened did not belong to him alone. And Asha closed her hand gently around the necklace, holding it not as something returned, but as something shared, something that no longer needed to be carried alone. Behind them, the town shifted again, but this time it was not out of fear, it was something quieter, something closer to reflection, as if each person was turning inward, retracing their own steps from earlier that day, hearing their own words with new clarity, and finding no place to hide from them. Mayor Pike lowered his gaze at last, not because he had been forced to, but because he could not hold it any longer, and in that small motion, the rest followed, one by one, hats tilted downward, eyes dropping to the dust, not in submission, but in understanding, because what stood before them was not something they could argue with. It was something they had to accept. The rider gave a slight nod, not to the town, but to Caleb, and then he stepped back, returning to his place. Without ceremony, without lingering, and the line of riders behind him mounted again in the same quiet order they had dismounted. No rush, no noise, just purpose carried out without display. Asha remained for a moment longer, standing beside Caleb, her presence calm, steady, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but it reached him clearly. "You did not know who I was," she said, "and you did not need to." And Caleb let out a slow breath, his eyes resting on the horizon where the riders would soon disappear. "I still do not," he replied, and there was something in that answer, something simple and unchanging, that made her smile just slightly, not wide, not obvious, but real. She stepped back then, turning to follow the others, the necklace catching the last line of sunlight before it settled against her hand once more, and as the riders began to move, their presence faded the same way it had arrived, steady, quiet, leaving behind not dust, not fear, but something heavier, something that would stay. Caleb stood alone again in the middle of the street, just as he had at the beginning, but the silence around him was different now, no longer filled with doubt or mockery, but with something deeper, something the town would carry long after the sound of hooves was gone, because out here, justice did not need to shout. It only needed someone willing to stand, even when no one else would.